It was 4 a.m. The house on King Road was quiet. Inside, for University of Idaho students were asleep after a Saturday night out. The small college town of Moscow felt peaceful, the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors. Then a shadow moved. A door opened, and in less than 20 minutes, 4 lives would be taken. If you listen closely to the official timeline, it almost feels unreal. For 04 a.m., a white sedan is captured on surveillance footage circling the neighborhood. 4:12 a.m., a DoorDash delivery is reportedly dropped off. For 17 a.m., a security camera from a nearby home records distorted sounds. A whimper, a thud, and a dog barking. Then silence. By sunrise, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were dead, and the killer was gone. Moscow, Idaho is not the kind of town that prepares for something like this. It's small, tight-knit, built around the University of Idaho campus. Students walk to class. Neighbors recognize each other's cars. Violent crime is rare. The King Road house sat slightly elevated on a hill, a 3-story rental popular with students. Friends came and went often. Lights were on late. Music played. It was normal. That Saturday night, the roommates had gone out separately. Kaylee and Madison were seen at a local bar before stopping by a food truck. Surveillance video later showed them laughing, unaware of what the next few hours would bring. Xana and Ethan had attended a fraternity party earlier in the evening. By 2 a.m., everyone had returned home, or so it seemed. Investigators would later say the suspect's vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra, was seen making multiple passes near the home before the attack. The footage became one of the earliest public clues. But at the time, no one noticed anything unusual. The attack is believed to have started on the 3rd floor. Kaylee and Madison were found together in the same room. On the 2nd floor, Xana and Ethan were attacked. 2 other roommates were inside the home that night and survived. One of them later told investigators she heard what sounded like someone crying and a male voice saying, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." She opened her door. She saw a masked man dressed in black walking past her toward the sliding glass door. He walked out. She locked her door, and for hours no one called 911. That detail stunned the nation when it was revealed. But trauma responses are complex. Confusion, shock, disbelief, they can distort time. At 11:58 a.m., police finally received a call reporting an unconscious person. Officers arrived expecting a medical emergency. Instead, they walked into one of the most shocking crime scenes in Idaho history. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the country. For young lives, no forced entry, no immediate suspect. The weapon was believed to be a fixed-blade knife. There were no obvious signs of struggle outside the rooms, and the killer had left behind almost nothing. Almost. On a bed near Madison's body, investigators discovered a knife sheath, tan leather, U.S. Marine Corps emblem stamped on the front. It would become the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. But in those first days, law enforcement had very little to share publicly. Rumors filled the vacuum. Was it a targeted attack? Was it random? Was the killer someone they knew? Fear spread across campus. Parents pulled students out of dorms. Classes shifted online. Vigils were held under cold November skies. Police insisted there was no ongoing threat to the community, then later clarified that the suspect had not yet been identified. That contradiction fueled anxiety. Every white sedan became suspicious. Every unfamiliar face felt dangerous. Weeks passed. The investigation stretched across state lines. More than 19,000 tips poured in. Over 100 pieces of evidence were collected. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Still no arrest. The FBI joined local and state authorities. Analysts reconstructed the timeline down to minutes. Digital forensics teams combed through cell tower data. Video footage from neighboring homes was reviewed repeatedly. Then came the break. The white Hyundai Elantra. Law enforcement asked the public for help locating a 2011 to 2013 model seen near the crime scene. Tips flooded in again. One of them led to a criminology PhD student studying at Washington State University, just 10 miles away. His name, Bryan Kohberger. He drove a white Hyundai Elantra. Cell phone records allegedly placed him near the victim's house multiple times before the murders. And DNA from the knife sheath reportedly matched him through investigative genetic genealogy. When news of the arrest broke weeks later, it stunned the country. A criminology student, someone studying criminal behavior, accused of committing one of the most horrifying crimes in recent memory. But in Module 1, the mystery still dominates. Because before the DNA, before the arrest, before the courtroom battles, there was that house, that early morning silence, that 4:17 a.m. audio clip from a neighbor's security camera. A thud, a whimper, a dog barking, then nothing. For families would receive calls that would change their lives forever. The nation would begin obsessing over timelines, forensic evidence, and motive. And a quiet college town would become the center of one of America's most followed true crime cases. As the story unfolds, one question drives everything. Who could walk into a house full of students, commit such violence, and disappear into the night without leaving a clear trace? We break down the investigation, the white Hyundai, the phone pings, the DNA breakthrough, and how a single overlooked clue led detectives to a suspect hiding in plain sight. Because sometimes the smallest piece of evidence is all it takes to crack a case wide open. First, there was nothing. No suspect, no murder weapon, no forced entry. Just 4 students dead inside a quiet house in Moscow, Idaho, and a killer who had slipped back into the darkness. But what investigators didn't know yet was this. The killer made a mistake so small, it was almost invisible. A leather knife sheath, a single snap button, and on it DNA. That tiny trace would unravel everything. The days after November 13th, 2022 were filled with fear and confusion. The University of Idaho community was paralyzed. Students left campus. Parents drove through the night to bring their children home. Rumors spread faster than facts. Police said there was no ongoing threat. But how could that be? For people had been brutally stabbed in their beds. The victims, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were young, social, and loved. There was no obvious connection to a hardened criminal. Investigators processed the house for days. Blood patterns, footwear impressions, door handles, bedding. They reconstructed the killer's path through the home. And then they found it. A tan leather K-bar knife sheath lying on the bed next to one of the victims. It didn't belong to anyone in the house. It wasn't random. It had been left behind. On the metal snap button of that sheath, forensic technicians located a single source of male DNA. Just one profile, no match in Cody's, no immediate suspect. But that single sample would become the backbone of the case. Meanwhile, outside the forensic lab, investigators worked another angle. Surveillance cameras. Moscow may be a small town, but doorbell cameras, traffic cams, and security systems are everywhere. Detectives pulled hours upon hours of footage from surrounding neighborhoods. Around 4 a.m., they began spotting something. A white sedan. It appeared near the victim's home multiple times before the murders. It circled the area, disappeared, then it returned. The vehicle sped away shortly after the estimated time of the killings. Police publicly announced they were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra. The announcement triggered a nationwide response. Tips flooded in, but one tip stood out. At Washington State University, campus police ran a check of registered white Hyundai Elantras owned by students. One name came back, Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology. He lived just across state lines in Pullman, Washington, about a 15-minute drive from Moscow. His car matched the description, and his phone number was on file. Detectives obtained a search warrant for historical cell phone data. What they found intensified the suspicion. In the months before the murders, Kohberger's phone had pinged near the victim's residence multiple times, often late at night or early in the morning. 12 times, according to court documents. After the murders, his phone went silent during the critical window of the attack. then reappeared south of Moscow hours later. To investigators, it looked like someone trying not to be tracked. But suspicion isn't proof. They needed confirmation. That's when forensic genealogy entered the picture. The DNA from the sheath didn't match anyone in criminal databases. So investigators turned to a technique that has solved cold cases across the country, comparing DNA to public genealogy databases to identify relatives. It's the same method used to identify the Golden State Killer. Technicians built a genetic family tree from distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA online. Slowly, they narrowed branches. Eventually, they identified a family line in Pennsylvania. And at the top of that branch was Bryan Kohberger. But they still needed direct confirmation. By December 2022, surveillance teams were watching him at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He had driven cross-country with his father after the semester ended. Investigators waited. Then, in a calculated move, they retrieved trash from outside the family residence. Inside that trash was discarded DNA from Kohberger's father. Lab testing revealed a near-certain biological relationship between the sheath DNA and the Kohberger family line. Statistical probability: 99.9998%. That was the break. But the story doesn't end there. Phone data also showed something chilling. On the morning after the murders, around 9 a.m., Kohberger's phone pinged near the victim's house again. Investigators allege he returned to the area. Why? To see the aftermath? To relive it? To confirm something? No one knows. Meanwhile, classmates began coming forward with unsettling observations. Some described him as socially awkward. Others said he had intense eyes, that he rarely smiled. One former classmate said he had once spoken about understanding criminal minds in unsettling detail. Online, amateur detectives dissected his past, old Reddit posts, academic papers, even a survey he once posted asking criminals about their feelings during the commission of a crime. Felt surreal. A criminology PhD student, studying crime, possibly committing one. Was it academic curiosity turned obsession? Or something darker? Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, the defense would later argue something critical. There was no murder weapon recovered. There was no clear motive established. There were no eyewitnesses identifying him inside the house. The prosecution's case was built on DNA on the sheath, a vehicle identification, cell phone data, surveillance footage, behavioral patterns. Individually, each piece could be challenged. Together, they formed a narrative. But narratives must withstand court scrutiny, and that would become the central battle. As December came to a close, investigators were ready to move. The DNA, the vehicle, the phone records, they believed they had their man. What began as a mystery with no suspect had transformed into one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in America. But one haunting question lingered. If he was watching them for months, if he studied criminal behavior, if he allegedly tried to conceal his phone signal, then how did he leave the sheath behind? Was it panic? Overconfidence? Or the fatal flaw of someone who thought they were smarter than everyone else? Because in the end, it may not have been brute force or eyewitness testimony that cracked this case. It may have been a single snap button, a microscopic trace, a decision made in seconds that would echo across a courtroom. And now, with an arrest imminent, the quiet academic life of Bryan Kohberger was about to collide with national scrutiny. But being arrested is not the same as being convicted. And in the American justice system, suspicion, even overwhelming suspicion, must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The war over that DNA was just beginning. They waited until he was asleep. 2 a.m., Pennsylvania, a quiet, gated community. Outside the house, law enforcement moved into position. Silent, deliberate, armed. Inside, a criminology PhD student slept in his childhood bedroom. For 6 weeks, investigators had watched him, followed him, collected his trash, matched his DNA. Now they were ready. The knock wouldn't come. The door would be forced. And before sunrise, the man accused of murdering 4 Idaho students would be in handcuffs. December 30th, 2022. The snow-covered streets of Albrightsville, Pennsylvania looked nothing like the college town of Moscow, Idaho. But this was where the investigation had led. After weeks of forensic work, surveillance, and cross-country coordination, authorities were ready to move in on Bryan Kohberger. Behind the scenes, federal agents, Pennsylvania State Police, and Idaho investigators had been working quietly. No press leaks, no public hints that the suspect had been identified. Kohberger had driven home with his father earlier in December after finishing the semester at Washington State University. Bodycam footage from a traffic stop during that road trip would later surface. Father and son pulled over twice in Indiana for minor traffic violations. Calm, polite, ordinary. Nothing about those clips suggested the man in the passenger seat was suspected of quadruple homicide. Back in Pennsylvania, surveillance intensified. Agents observed Kohberger wearing gloves while handling trash. According to later reports, he was seen placing his garbage in neighbors' bins in the early morning hours, possibly attempting to avoid leaving behind usable DNA. Investigators waited patiently. They needed confirmation. When trash was retrieved from outside the home and analyzed, DNA belonging to Kohberger's father showed a near-perfect familial match to the male DNA found on the knife sheath at the Idaho crime scene. That was enough. The warrant was signed. The arrest team assembled before dawn. Neighbors would later describe flashing lights piercing the darkness. Some said they heard a loud bang as officers forced entry. Inside the house, chaos erupted. Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody without reported injury. Reports later claimed he asked, "Has anyone else been arrested?" If true, it was a strange question. Was he implying accomplices? Or simply shocked at the sudden raid? Authorities searched the home for hours, collecting potential evidence, electronics, clothing, personal items. Meanwhile, nearly 2,500 miles away, news began to break in Idaho. The community that had lived in fear for weeks finally had a name. Shock turned to fascination. A criminology PhD student, studying criminal justice, accused of committing one of the most brutal college town murders in recent memory. National media swarmed the story. Images of Kohberger's booking photo spread across television screens and social media feeds. He appeared expressionless, hollow-eyed, clean-shaven. The contrast was jarring. No prior violent criminal record, advanced education, seemingly structured life. But investigators believed they had built a strong case. Still, the legal process had only just begun. Kohberger waived extradition in Pennsylvania court, meaning he would be transported back to Idaho to face charges. During his court appearance, he stood silent, listening to the accusations. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of felony burglary. He did not enter a plea at that time. Within days, he was flown back west under heavy guard. The small-town airport in Idaho became a media circus. Cameras lined the perimeter. When he arrived in Latah County, security was tight. Protesters and curious residents gathered outside the jail. The probable cause affidavit was finally unsealed, and the details inside were chilling. It outlined the white Hyundai Elantra spotted circling the victim's house. It detailed phone pings placing Kohberger near the residence multiple times before the murders. It described the sheath with DNA on the snap button. It referenced a surviving roommate who saw a masked man with bushy eyebrows walking past her in the early morning hours. The affidavit painted a narrative of calculated movement, entering through sliding glass doors, moving upstairs first, then downstairs. It alleged that Kohberger's phone was turned off or placed in airplane mode during the time of the killings, and it suggested he returned near the house hours later. The public reaction was explosive. How could someone studying crime allegedly commit such a crime? Was this a twisted experiment? An obsession? A fantasy turned real? Former classmates began speaking to media outlets. Some described him as socially awkward. Others said he was intense in class discussions about criminal minds. One former acquaintance from Pennsylvania described him as having struggled socially in high school. Reports surfaced about past heroin use, weight loss transformation, and personality changes over time. Online speculation grew uncontrollably. But inside the courtroom, speculation doesn't matter. evidence does. When Kohberger appeared before a judge in Idaho, he remained composed. Clean haircut, neutral expression. He was assigned public defenders experienced in capital cases. The prosecution signaled they would pursue the death penalty if convicted. And that changed everything. Capital punishment cases moved differently, slower, more complex, more scrutinized. Pretrial hearings began stacking up. Defense attorneys would soon challenge the validity of genealogical DNA methods, the interpretation of phone data, the timeline reconstruction, the lack of a recovered murder weapon. Because despite the dramatic arrest and media frenzy, there were still unanswered questions. Where was the knife? What was the motive? Was there direct physical evidence placing him inside the house beyond the sheath? The defense would argue that touch DNA can transfer indirectly. They would challenge the narrative of stalking based on cell pings. They would raise the issue of contamination possibilities. Meanwhile, families of the victims sat quietly in court, enduring every headline and procedural delay. For them, the arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a long legal war. The community of Moscow remained divided between relief and lingering fear. Relief that a suspect was in custody. Fear that justice is never guaranteed. Because arresting someone is one thing, convicting them beyond a reasonable doubt is another. And capital cases require jurors to weigh life and death. As 2023 unfolded, motions, hearings, and evidence disputes dominated proceedings. The trial would not happen quickly, but the stakes were now crystal clear. If prosecutors proved their case, Bryan Kohberger could face execution. If the defense successfully dismantles the forensic narrative, reasonable doubt could change everything. The image of that pre-dawn raid in Pennsylvania became symbolic. A door forced open, a suspect pulled from sleep, a quiet neighborhood stunned awake. But the real storm wasn't the SWAT entry. It was the courtroom battle that followed. Because in America, no matter how dramatic the arrest, the Constitution demands proof. And now, 12 future jurors would eventually be asked to answer one irreversible question. Did Bryan Kohberger commit the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin? Or is there another explanation hidden within the evidence? The manhunt was over. The trial war had begun. The prosecution says the evidence is overwhelming. DNA, phone records, surveillance footage, a white car circling the house. But in a courtroom, overwhelming means nothing. There is only one standard that matters, beyond a reasonable doubt. And now, Bryan Kohberger's defense team is preparing to attack every single piece of the state's case. Because if they can create just one crack in the narrative, the entire structure could collapse. Capital murder trials are not about emotion. They are about precision. By the time pretrial hearings began intensifying, prosecutors had made their intentions clear. They would seek the death penalty if Kohberger is convicted. That decision raised the stakes to the highest level. Death penalty cases demand extraordinary scrutiny. Every motion matters. Every piece of evidence is dissected, tested, challenged. And the defense wasted no time going on the offensive. Their first target, DNA. The knife sheath found beside one of the victims contained a single source of male DNA on the snap button. That DNA, investigators allege, matches Kohberger. But the defense argues something critical. It's touch DNA. Touch DNA can transfer in indirect ways. It doesn't prove when the DNA was left. It doesn't prove how it was deposited. It doesn't prove that the person was present at the time of the crime. They question chain of custody procedures. They question lab protocols. They question the relatively new use of investigative genetic genealogy to identify suspects through public ancestry databases. The prosecution views it as cutting-edge science. The defense frames it as experimental and potentially flawed. If they can convince jurors that the DNA identification process has weaknesses, doubt begins to grow. Next battlefield, cell phone data. Investigators allege that Kohberger's phone pinged near the victim's residence multiple times in the months before the murders. They argue it suggests stalking behavior, but the defense challenges the interpretation. Cell tower pings are not GPS precision. They can cover wide areas. Being in range of a tower does not mean someone was parked outside a specific house. They also point to a key detail. The phone was allegedly inactive during the window of the murders. Prosecutors interpret that as intentional concealment. Defense attorneys could argue it simply proves the phone was off, and absence of data is not proof of presence. Then there's the white Hyundai Elantra. Surveillance footage shows a white sedan circling the neighborhood before and after the murders. Investigators traced a vehicle matching that description to Kohberger. But the defense could argue how many white Hyundai Elantras exist in the region? Is the footage clear enough to show license plates? Can the prosecution prove beyond doubt that it was his vehicle and not another similar model? Reasonable doubt can live in blurry video. And then there's the glaring gap. The murder weapon has never been publicly recovered. No knife tied directly to Kohberger has been introduced. No blood-covered clothing found in his apartment has been revealed in official filings. For jurors, that absence may matter. The prosecution will argue that killers often dispose of weapons successfully. The defense will ask, if the state's case is so strong, where is the knife? Another potential flashpoint centers around a surviving roommate who reported seeing a masked man inside the home the night of the murders. She described someone with bushy eyebrows walking past her. Prosecutors may use this to establish presence. But eyewitness accounts, especially under trauma and darkness, can be challenged. Lighting conditions, stress, memory distortion. The defense will scrutinize every word of her testimony. Because in a capital case, the burden is immense. Meanwhile, prosecutors are building their narrative carefully. They will argue premeditation. They will argue planning. They will argue that the suspect turned off his phone to avoid detection, drove across state lines, entered the home in the early morning hours, and targeted the victims deliberately. But motive remains one of the biggest unanswered questions. Why? There has been no clear public evidence of a direct relationship between Kohberger and the victims. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Chapin. Were they randomly chosen? Was one the intended target? Was it fixation, fantasy, a desire for control? Without a clear motive, jurors are left to focus almost entirely on forensic evidence. The defense may use that absence strategically. They don't need to prove innocence. They only need to create doubt. And doubt can grow from small inconsistencies. In hearings, defense attorneys have pushed for access to raw lab data. They've sought to challenge the scope of search warrants. They've raised issues about media influence and pretrial publicity. Because another factor looms over this case: national attention. This case exploded across television, podcasts, and social media. True crime communities dissected every rumor. Amateur sleuths created timelines and suspect theories before an arrest was even made. Finding an unbiased jury could be a challenge. The defense may argue that pretrial publicity has poisoned the jury pool. Prosecutors will argue that careful voir dire, the jury selection process, can filter bias. But in high-profile cases, perception matters. If even one juror enters deliberation with lingering uncertainty about DNA handling, or cell tower interpretation, or vehicle identification, the result could shift dramatically. And then there's the psychological element. The prosecution may paint Kohberger as someone obsessed with criminal behavior, a criminology student who studied how criminals think and allegedly attempted to outsmart law enforcement. The defense will likely counter that academic study is not evidence of intent. Studying crime does not make someone a killer. The courtroom will become a battle of narratives. On one side, a calculated predator who left behind a tiny but fatal mistake. On the other, a man accused based on circumstantial evidence and emerging forensic techniques. Both stories cannot be true. And in the center sit future jurors, ordinary citizens tasked with evaluating complex DNA science, digital tracking data, and human memory under oath. If convicted, Kohberger could face life in prison without parole or the death penalty. If acquitted, he walks free. There is no middle ground. As pretrial proceedings continue, each motion filed shapes the battlefield. Will the DNA evidence withstand scrutiny? Will the phone data hold up under cross-examination? Will the prosecution establish motive strongly enough to satisfy jurors? Or will the defense carve enough uncertainty into the timeline to fracture the case? Because at this stage, it's no longer about the horror of November 13th. It's about legal thresholds. It's about standards of proof. It's about whether science, technology, and circumstantial links combine into certainty, or remain a collection of suspicions. The state believes the pieces fit. The defense insists the puzzle is incomplete. And when the trial begins, the courtroom will transform into the final arena. The arrest shocked the nation. But this phase, the evidence war, may decide everything. Because in the American justice system, the loudest headlines don't win. Proof does. And soon, 12 jurors will be asked to determine whether the prosecution's narrative is airtight, or whether one small thread of doubt is enough to unravel it all. 12 strangers will walk into a courtroom. They will sit down. They will listen. And when it's over, they will decide whether a man lives or dies. Not based on headlines, not based on social media theories, not based on fear, but on evidence. Because in this case, the murders of 4 Idaho students, the final word will not belong to police or the media or the internet. It will belong to a jury, and their decision will echo far beyond that courtroom. By the time the trial begins, nearly 2 years will have passed since the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. The small college town of Moscow, Idaho will once again find itself under a national spotlight. But this time, it won't be about mystery. It will be about judgment. When Bryan Kohberger enters the courtroom, the world will be watching. Cameras won't be allowed inside during proceedings, but every motion, every objection, every testimony will be reported in real time. The prosecution will go first. They will present their timeline. They will show jurors surveillance clips of a white Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood in the early morning darkness. They will display phone records mapping movement patterns in the months leading up to the murders. They will introduce forensic experts to explain the DNA found on the knife sheath. They will call investigators who traced genealogical data through family lines to identify the suspect. And they will attempt to weave it all into one clear narrative. Premeditation, planning, execution. They may argue that Kohberger studied criminal behavior not just academically, but operationally. That he turned off his phone to avoid digital tracking. That he entered the home through a sliding glass door. That he moved room to room. That he left behind a sheath in a fatal oversight. The state's case will be methodical, but then the defense rises, and everything slows down. They don't have to prove innocence. They only need to prove doubt. They will cross-examine the DNA experts. They will question lab procedures. They will emphasize that touch DNA does not indicate when it was deposited. They will highlight the absence of the murder weapon. They will point out that no blood-soaked clothing has been publicly tied to Kohberger. They will challenge the reliability of cell tower pings. They will question the clarity of surveillance footage. And perhaps most critically, they may emphasize the lack of direct evidence placing him inside the home at the exact time of the murders. No eyewitness identification. No confession, no recovered weapon, just a chain of circumstantial evidence. And in American courtrooms, circumstantial evidence can convict, but only if jurors believe the chain is unbroken. The prosecution will likely call surviving witnesses. They may describe the layout of the home. They may recount the terror of that night. Every testimony will carry emotional weight. Families of the victims will sit feet away from the man accused of ending 4 lives. The courtroom will be heavy with silence during certain moments. Every juror will feel it, but they must compartmentalize emotion from law. If the jury finds Kohberger guilty of first-degree murder, the trial moves into a second phase, sentencing, because this is a death penalty case. In the sentencing phase, jurors would decide between life imprisonment without parole or execution. That decision requires its own deliberation, weighing aggravating factors against mitigating ones. Aggravating factors may include multiple victims, alleged premeditation, the nature of the crime. Mitigating factors could include lack of prior violent convictions, mental health considerations, background history, The burden in a capital case is enormous. A unanimous decision is required for death. If even one juror refuses, the sentence could shift to life in prison. And if the jury cannot reach a unanimous verdict in the guilt phase, a mistrial, if acquitted, Kohberger walks free. There is no partial verdict here. It is binary, guilty or not guilty, life or death. Meanwhile, the impact stretches beyond one courtroom. This case has already reshaped conversations about campus safety, digital privacy, genetic genealogy, the ethics of public DNA databases. Investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique used here, has become one of the most powerful tools in modern policing. But it also raises privacy concerns. How far should law enforcement be allowed to go when tracing family DNA? If a conviction hinges on this technique, it could reinforce its legitimacy in courts nationwide. If the defense successfully undermines it, future cases may face stronger challenges. The verdict could influence more than one life. It could influence future investigations across America. For the families of the victims, the trial is not about legal precedent. It is about closure. But closure is a complicated word. Even a guilty verdict does not restore what was lost. Even a sentence cannot undo November 13th. As jury deliberations begin, the courtroom empties. 12 people sit around a table. They review exhibits. They replay testimony. They scrutinize timelines. They debate whether the evidence forms a complete picture. One juror may say, "The DNA is clear." Another may say, "But we don't know when it got there." One may argue, "The car matches." Another may ask, "But is it definitively his in the footage?" Hours turn into days. The nation waits. Families wait. And Bryan Kohberger waits. When the verdict is finally reached, the courtroom will fill again. The foreperson will stand. The clerk will ask for the decision. And in that moment, before the word is spoken, the air will feel electric. Because this case has never been simple. It began with horror. It evolved into mystery. It escalated into a cross-country arrest. It transformed into a forensic battleground. And now it rests in the hands of 12 citizens. If convicted, appeals could follow for years. If sentenced to death, automatic appeals are triggered. If sentenced to life, the legal process still continues through post-conviction motions. If acquitted, the shockwaves would be immediate. But regardless of outcome, the case of the Idaho student murders has already carved itself into modern true crime history. For young lives lost, a criminology student accused, a nation captivated, and a justice system tasked with delivering certainty in a world filled with uncertainty. In the end, this trial will not be remembered only for its headlines. It will be remembered for the question it forced every juror to confront. When evidence is complex, when science is evolving, when narratives collide, what does beyond a reasonable doubt truly mean? And once that answer is spoken in court, there is no taking it back.